today, it's going to be kind of a short presentation because I know we're going to have a lot of discussion about this because it has to do with security of your student data and, well, basically everything. So we're going to talk about developer keys. And I apparently didn't get the memo. I didn't make any references to any James Bond movies or spy movies or anything like that. So I apologize that you're not going to get any clever puns or anything like that. So what are developer keys? Well, I'll start off with what they aren't. They're not really used for development. They are something that you give to a third-party company or basically a developer that has created an application that's going to work with your instance of Canvas. And I specify that because it's not something you want to give to somebody who's still figuring it out. You want it to be a fully tested application before you give them this kind of access. Also, it's not the same as an access token. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's something that any user in Canvas can create. They can go into their settings, in their user settings and create one. I'll show you that screen a bit later. But those allow that user to access the Canvas APIs and do anything that that user is normally allowed to do. So the APIs are restricted in that way. They're also something you don't give out willy-nilly. And that's really the whole point of this presentation, is to show you why you shouldn't just give these out. So getting into what they actually are, they're a part of the OAuth 2 process for Canvas. And if you're not aware what OAuth 2 is, it is a standard that many websites implement, and it allows third-party applications to, in this case, use Canvas for user authentication, which is similar to a single sign-on. It's not the same, but similar idea. It also allows that third-party application to perform actions on behalf of the current user. And websites like Facebook, Google, GitHub, many others use this standard. And they use it in a different way, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. First, I want to show you how to create a developer key to make sure we're on the same page as far as what I'm talking about for the rest of this. So the image is a bit small, but I'll try to be descriptive of the locations of these things. So in the account admin menu, there's a developer keys menu item. If you click on that and then you click on the, I can't read the text on this screen, and click on the add developer key button in the top right, that will bring you to this dialog. And for the most part, you're just going to be filling in whatever that third-party app provider gives you to fill in here. But the name field and the notes field are for your own records. And those are really important if you want to just keep track of who created that developer key and why, and maybe there's an expiration on it that you want to delete it later, something like that. So let's get a little bit into what the actual OAuth 2 workflow is. So the user opens up this third-party application, and then that third-party application sends the user, it redirects them in their browser, redirects them to an authorization page on the Canvas side of things. That authorization page looks like this. This particular one's for you do it, but it allows them to click authorize or cancel. And let me go back to the previous slide. When the user clicks authorize or cancel, Canvas then sends the user, redirects again in their browser, redirects them back to the third-party application, and sends along with it some extra data, which includes a message that has the user's response in it. And if the user authorized that third-party app, they click the authorize button, that response, that package that it sends over, will include a one-time use code. The app will then communicate with Canvas on the back end. So independent of the user, this is a server-to-server communication. It communicates with Canvas, sends that one-time use code, and exchanges that. Okay. And exchanges that one-time use code for an access token, which is what I was talking about before, the API key, as some people call it. So now that application has an API key for that user, meaning that everything they do looks like it's that user. So there are some options, though. Apps can allow users to log out, meaning that it will delete that authorization, and whatever access keys were granted are no longer viable, and that kind of thing. Users can also manually remove the app from their authorizations if they don't want to use that service anymore, or they, I don't know, got weirded out by it somehow. And they can go to their approved integrations list on their user settings page, which is what I was talking about earlier. This is where you would create your own access token. So all they have to do is just click the trash can icon next to it, and it removes the app authorization. So there are a few differences between how Canvas implements Auth2 and how, for example, Facebook implements it. When you go to a website and they say, sign in with Facebook, you click on it. Yeah, sure, I want to sign in. I want to create another account on this website. So you click on that, and it gives you a little screen that says, this app is allowed to post on your timeline, or read your friends list, or whatever. You are informed, you know exactly what that app can do, and you can decide whether to authorize it or not. However, in Canvas, there is no granularity to, or scoping to those permissions. So that means that everything that user can do, that app can do after the user authorizes that app. So let's dig into that a little bit more. The most innocuous one is the user's name and email address. Depending on your interpretation of FERPA, the email address might not be, that might be protected information. I know it is for UCF. So that's, that's kind of bad. And then ability to send messages to other Canvas users, particularly the ones in your own course. We've actually had some apps abuse that and start sending out advertisements through the mail system or the messages system. It also would have the ability to change course content or upload files to a course if a teacher authorized the app. And then I know you've all read ahead already, so there's no revealing this. It would also have access to all grades that user has access to. So if it's a student, it's their own grades. If it's a teacher, it's all grades for all courses that they've ever taught for all students. And if it's an admin, that app is now an admin on your system. So they would have access to, of course, every single grade, every single course. They could, if it's a high enough level admin, they could even authorize new apps and do all kinds of crazy fun things on your system. So I do want to say, though, that these app developers are not out to be evil. It's just you have to do your due diligence to make sure that you're vetting these apps, I guess, before you implement them or give them a dev key. So how do you protect yourself? Many of you are probably already doing this. You want to send them some kind of questionnaire or disclosure form for the security of their application. For any of the software that you're probably already implementing on campus, outside of Canvas, you're probably already sending this form. So you could probably just take whatever that is from your security office and adapt it to the LMS environment. And so you want to ask for things like, what kind of data do they access? How do they use that data? Do they store that data? And if so, how long do they store it? Will they delete it after your contract is up? Will they sell it to some other company for marketing data or something like that? This next bullet point is not really actually that important because every third-party app is basically required to use SSL anyway. Canvas will put a big red box saying this app is not secured. But just keep that in mind whenever they send you their information, that redirect URI, just make sure it has HTTPS in the front of it. You can also, this might be getting a little bit extreme, but you can actually inspect the infrastructure of that third-party app. You could do a site visit if that often doesn't really mean a whole lot because everything's in the cloud now, so what are you going to do, visit Northern Virginia and look at the AWS server farm? But you want to look at how they store the developer key that you gave them and any refresh tokens that, which I'll get into what, did I mention a refresh token earlier? We'll get into that later. But you also want to see if they even store access tokens because there is a way that you can just forget the access token and then refresh it later. And then also, whenever you do actually create this developer key for this third-party app, don't just email it to them, please. Don't read it over the phone. You want to, don't send it an instant message or a text message. Those are not secure communication channels. I know that some people say, oh, if you send it in like 3 different emails, it's safe. But no, it's not. You want to use something like Ironbox or Project Send. I'm not advocating either of these tools. They're just basically the 2 that came up when I searched for them. So we personally use Project Send on our own installation. And then if you are an admin on your instance of Canvas, really, really think hard about authorizing that app. Don't, going into that app and authorizing it, because you don't want that app to become an admin on your system. So OAuth 2 does have some built-in security. The redirect URI that you put in when you're registering or creating that developer key is the only URI that Canvas will redirect the user back to. So even if somebody stole your developer key, they would have to also completely hijack your server and host their own application on your server at your URL in order to be able to use that developer key. Also, all access tokens that are created expire. I put 1 hour, but I actually just talked to somebody this morning, and they said that, actually it was you. And it's 30 minutes. Access tokens will expire in 30 minutes. And that's what the refresh token is for. The app can then request a new access token for that user when it expires. So I felt the need to put in some developer best practices. So this is from the app developer's point of view, some things that you can do to make your application more secure. Don't embed any developer keys, access tokens, refresh tokens, anything like that. Don't embed it in a web page. Don't put it in JavaScript. That's all user-facing, and anybody can just view source and see that code. Don't pass any keys, tokens, session IDs, or anything around in URLs. And if this seems familiar, you've probably already read the documentation, because I adapted this from Canvas's own documentation. You also want to properly secure your database, which that's another topic entirely. I'm not going to get too much into that, and that really depends on your own infrastructure. But just make sure that you're storing your access tokens and refresh tokens in a secure way. And then if possible, just forget the access token at the end of whatever task or whatever session, and just regenerate a new one next time. So here's just some links. I have my email address here, jacob.bates@ucf.edu. If you have any questions about, I also have cards up here if you don't want to take a picture. If you have any questions about this that you didn't get to ask today, you can send me an email. And then I've just got a few links to some of the documentation that is already in the Canvas documentation. But really, I want to open it up to questions. This was only a 24-minute presentation, but I know that security is a big topic. Everybody has a completely different setup at their school, and I kind of wanted to open this up and get some questions from all of you. So, you first.
Edgewrap has a lot of LTIs that include developer keys. So these are third parties that we don't necessarily have a contract with, and I know that this is not a question regarding homegrown developer keys. But in your research, do you know if Canvas has an agreement? We would not install a developer key on our own without a firm.
Right.
But
so
you've got these things that people can just install without asking the app.
Right. So the question was, or the statement, I guess, / question, was that there's the Edgewrap Center. There's a bunch of apps on there that your school has not had any communication with. You don't know anything about them, and instructors can just go in and add those to their courses. So there was a shift in how developer keys are passed out. I think, was it like a year, maybe 2 ago, something like that. There was a certain app that I'm not going to name that was abusing the system a bit. And they changed it from a global developer key that would work with any Canvas instance to a per instance basis. So I'm not sure about individual apps. Maybe some of them are still using those legacy developer keys. But any of the new ones that are coming out are not doing that. So those you'll have to contact, like they'll have to talk to you before they can do anything on your system, yeah. And we actually had that happen. We had a vendor that was operating on our instance of Canvas without us even knowing it. all the access keys, or all the developer keys rather, got revoked, and then all of a sudden, now we're talking with them because they want to get our business back. So I think you were next.
So maybe to piggyback on that one, so that may be though, thinking, would it be though, like so the ones that you can install through the App Store, right? So you can install, they just want a shared secret, but they're not, so maybe in that situation, they're not actually pinging the actual Canvas API, you're just making a valid launch and it may be some kind of website, but you may not actually be pinging the API, and in that case, you may not need an access token to get certain, it's just basically open up an iframe.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I wanted to add something else that I forgot when I was answering your question. So the statement was, most of those apps on the Edgewrap Center are just using a key and secret kind of thing, and they're not actually using the API.
So they are creating tokens.
Exactly, they're not creating tokens. So this doesn't even apply to them. There's also another feature called whitelisting in the Edgewrap Center, or the whatever it's called within Canvas. So your institution can go in and just say, I only want these apps that we've already had contracts, we've already had them sign all the paperwork, we only want to make these available to our faculty. You were next.
So this question is either for you or anybody in Instructure, anybody here from Instructure that can answer the question. Have they shown any indication that they might move towards granularity with developer keys? And also, show of hands, how many people would be interested in that?
So, okay, so the question was, is Canvas, or Instructure rather, is there any indication that they are trying to scope developer keys? And also, I think over half of the room raised their hands on that. Probably everybody wants that. So I did actually hear just before this, this presentation that there has been some discussion about that. There is no timeline, at least that I know of. So in the meantime, we'll still need to worry about this, yeah. So you in the back.
To follow up on that, a couple of slides ago, you had a bullet point that said never authorize a third-party app on an administrator account.
Yes.
And I understand all the reasons for that. A question that our institution has as we are trying to evaluate whether to give out any developer keys is, are there any guidelines for best practices for admins who have to interact with or support apps that have to be integrated with a developer key? How do we do that?
Okay, so the question was, there was a bullet point about admins never authorizing an application using their own admin account. And then the question after that was, what are the best practices for administering third-party applications that you've installed? I don't think I can answer that. So that's really going to be different depending on your situation. And maybe it's an app that you really do trust and you're fine with that. You might go into that application as your admin, do something, and then go to your authorized, whatever that screen was called. Yeah, and go to your approved integrations list and then delete them immediately. You could do that. But I think we should continue that conversation on the Canvas community and see what everybody else is doing to kind of come up with some best practices for that. And yeah.
Thanks, Jacob. This is super helpful. In regards to protecting yourself and inspecting the infrastructure of an app, an awful lot of apps say they're LTI, but they're not really. Like, they'll only do certain aspects. So before you go down the whole rigmarole of like inspecting everything, would you recommend just spinning an open beta or another test instance to have a look?
So the question was, before you go through all the rigmarole of creating or going through the security process, all these things, and it might not even be LTI compliant, it might just do the bare minimum, is it okay to spin this up in a beta environment? That's right, yeah, okay. So I would still caution against that, because even in your beta environment, it's a clone of production data. So it might be a week or two old, but it's still data that is FERPA protected. So yeah, I caution against that. Also, the LTI standard is separate from this. So you can actually make an app that isn't an LTI. It actually sits somewhere else, and when you open that app, it takes you to the Canvas login screen. and that's what the authorization process looks like for that. So yeah, you kind of keep those two parts separate. And whether it implements all the parts of the LTI standard, yeah, that kind of goes outside of this too, because developers keys can be used without it. So.
What about a separate instance with just dummy data?
Yes, you could use a separate instance with dummy data. That's definitely a great idea. If your CSM is willing to set that up for testing purposes, yeah. I think you were next.
I just would make a note that if you wanted to be a bond villain, you'd be Dr. No for the LTI permission, because that can be restricted on the teacher role. Turn that off now.
So you were saying that I would be Dr. No because of the, yeah, I'll be Dr. No, yeah. And you were saying that there is you can turn off the LTI, the ability to add LTIs at the at a role level. That's cool. I didn't know that.
Question. Do you know how much of the actions of the developer key apps that use that, how much that's reflected in Canvas data so that you can go ahead and monitor that?
So the question was, do I know if there's any basically tracking of how this app accesses content in your instance through Canvas data? Is there any kind of way to do that? And I'm really not sure about that. I know that it shows up in page views. I believe they started tracking API calls in page views. It also shows up in page history. It'll do a new entry for that if you're editing a page using the APIs. So I'm really not sure how that shows up in Canvas data though.
My guess is it's using user tokens, which show up as the user. It'd be hard to tell.
So yeah, his guess is that it would show up as the user token, so you might not even know that it was that app, but you might think it was the user. I'll have to look into that because if it doesn't differentiate, I feel like it should. Because that user themselves did not do that, so that would be a lie, basically, to reflect it that way. So I think there's, yeah, back there.
So I'm just curious, what are the characteristics of an app that would require the developer to request a developer key instead of just having it? Because we have a vendor who we've had an LTI integration for quite a while, they just use the big secret and away you go. And now all of a sudden they're going to release a new version and they want a developer.
Okay.
What are they doing? Why is that?
That's a really good question, and I probably should have put that into this presentation. Sometimes I forget, like what what knowledge I already know, and what I need to put into presentation. So the question was, what would an app be doing that requires it to need a developer key? And in the past, there are some apps that they've just been using a key in secret, which is a totally different process. So an app, let's take UDoIt for example, that uses the APIs a lot. Like it needs to go into pages, it needs to change content of those pages, it needs to scan, like just pull all the HTML content in an entire course, and that is not possible to do with the LTI standard as it is today. There is movement in making the next versions of the LTI standard have some more back and forth communication, but basically that's when an app would need developer keys, is when they're going to do something more than the LTI standard can provide. Usually that involves changing content in the course or pulling a lot of data from a course or your system.
I guess piggybacking on that a little bit, is Instructure recommending developer keys for vendors now?
So you're asking if Instructure is recommending developer keys?
It seems like more and more vendors are using developer keys. So I'm wondering if Instructure is guiding them.
So yeah, the question was, is Instructure guiding the effort of third-party vendors towards requesting developer keys? I'm not sure it's Instructure necessarily. I think it's just the marketplace. Apps need to have more and more functionality. They need to be more deeply integrated. And there's really very little you can do with the LTI standard alone. There are some apps that were previously using some kind of super user API key, and they're switching over to developer keys. But again, that's just the same problem. Like you're literally giving them a super user API key. They don't even have to go through any of the rigmarole. So I think that's why it's the marketplace. Yeah.
And also with the developer key, that allows access across the instance, right? Where an LTI, if the application is using LTI, the LTI could be installed at a sub-account level and course level. So
That's a very good point. So yes, developer keys are an account level, like a major account level thing. You can't define them at sub-account levels. So yeah, that's exactly right. You can install an LTI at just the course level, but a developer key is good for the entire system. There's no way to get more granular than that.
Are you going to post your slides somewhere?
So I believe the slides and all the presentations will be posted on the Canvas community as videos, and then also the slides will be provided with them. If for some reason the slides aren't provided, I'll go in and make a comment and upload the video to it, or the slides to it. Yes.
I understand as an admin, you shouldn't authorize a developer or auth or a developer key. Is it the same for basic LTI integrations?
So the question was, understanding that admins, it's a bad idea to authorize a third-party app with your admin account. What about using just basic LTIs with your admin account? That's totally fine. It doesn't have any other extra level of access because it's just an LTI. It's just using the normal LTI communication methods. So for example, like something in the rich content editor, it's going to pass back an image or pass back HTML just like it would for any other user. So there's really no security risk there. You in the back.
Yeah, you mentioned, of course, issuing an admin level developer key. Can an admin create a role that's lower than an admin and use that as the authorization for that developer key?
So yeah, and that's a really great suggestion. So an admin could create a lower level admin account that is the one that they use to administer these LTIs or the apps requiring developer keys. That's a very good idea. Yes.
I think you may have highlighted this, but just further explain. So when you're actually granting someone a developer key, right, you'd actually have to, I think it used to be that you could just do one bigger URL and anything underneath that post URL, right? They could use, but now you have to have the exact endpoint. So if they're posting that, right, the callback URL has to be that exact one, otherwise it doesn't work. I think you may have highlighted that.
Yes, I just wanted to get back to that screen. So yeah, the statement was that with the redirect URI, it used to be a bit more generic. It was just what's the base URL of your server, but now it's literally what is the exact script, the exact page that Canvas is going to point back to. So now you do have the ability to put multiple URIs in though, or does it say URL? Yeah, URI. So yeah, you can put multiple in. Some apps use that. I've never actually used that myself, but maybe you have multiple instances of it and you want to use the same developer key. That might be, yeah.
I just wanted to share a personal story on this main key. I had a publisher call, was working with a faculty member to put materials into her course, and they asked me for the mid-level key. And you want to know, I don't even know what they were going to use it for. I said no so fast I didn't hear the end of the sentence. So, I mean, it was like, and they were like incredulous. Well, why won't you give us that? You want to know why.
Yeah, so, and we've had that happen too.
I'm not afraid to ask. Yeah.
So yeah, the story was for the viewers at home that he had some instructors that were doing some project and they wanted an admin level API key, and yeah, he said no immediately, which right you should have. We at UCF we do have some admin level keys, but those are very closely guarded. They're for internal applications only, or ones that are with like our central IT office. We never give those out to teachers. Yeah, I think you in the back.
Yeah, I think kind of follow up
Oh.
with back here that yeah, we just create like lower level admin accounts, a specific role for that particular development year. We have only got 2 in our systems,
Mhm.
and try to kind of limit the permissions as much as possible. It'd be really helpful to hear from vendors and say, hey, here's the permissions we need.
Right.
Trial and error to see, okay, now can your APIs get to what you want it to get to, and trying to give them the least amount of permissions on our system so they
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, creating a lower level admin account for an app, especially if they're asking for just an API key, definitely do that. It's the same practices you would use for making a unique username for for every database that an app uses, something like that.
I just want a vendor to then say, here's the minimum permissions we need versus this constant trial and error to finally get it the way they want it, which they do already in Canvas. And here's the ones we gotta have and the rest of them.
Exactly, yes. Communication with the vendor on exactly what access they need is a very good idea. So I think way back in the back you had a...
I think I was going to say something similar, but just from the perspective of the vendor, you're working on a proprietary platform, and now people publish third-party tool builders requires basically learn that system. I don't think that answer to that answer should have been yes, of course, but I think the more nuanced follow-up is about working with vendors about what permissions they need to provide functionality that they're adding to the Canvas system is something to consider.
Yes, definitely. So the statement was you definitely should consider the amount of functionality that application is adding to the system. Definitely if, just the Facebook example, it can read your timeline. Well, maybe that app really has a legitimate need to read your timeline. So that wouldn't be a scary permission to give them in that case. So yeah, these apps, and I'm not trying to vilify third-party app developers. I'm one myself. It's just we all need to do our due diligence in looking at what these apps actually do, looking at the credentials of that company, that kind of thing. So, well, everybody, you. Yeah.
So just a question about how developer keys work under a particular circumstance. So say you were a root level admin masquerading as, say, a faculty member, interacting with a tool that was integrated using a developer key. Whose level of permission is being exposed there? Is it the root admin, or is it the faculty member who has a much lower, a much more constrained access to data?
So the question was, what if you're an admin, a root level admin user masquerading as a student and you access one of these third-party applications? The answer is it will be an API key for that user that you're masquerading as, because we've actually used that in the past. There were weird cases where certain users couldn't authorize the app properly. We had an admin masquerade as that user to authorize them in, and then that user was fine after that. So I'm glad I actually knew that one. And I think you in the back, yes.
Yeah, it's just part of a comment to reinforce what you said about some of the questions to ask vendors. There's, at institutions nationwide, security is starting to become more of a concern. Our organization, we actually have a security process and a checklist that we have to go through from vendors and our first people before you just give away the token to check to see if there's a security check process in place for this type of thing, just because you could very quickly be in violation of your institution's security policy.
Yes.
Taking one piece, I think it might have been Prezi, we found that they would be aggregating, they'd be pulling all of the email addresses from, and then basically spamming people with spam, and that totally was in violation of our security policy. So just, I wanted to reinforce that.
Yeah, so the statement was just reinforcing that you want to double check with your security office, make sure you're following all the security protocols for your university, since those have been set up for decades, I'm sure. They've already done the work for you. Well, I guess depending on how old your institution is. So, yes.
Was your institution held up any of these tools that needed development tokens, or have you accepted the risk on almost every three?
So the question was, okay, I've got 5 minutes. So the question was, have we actually held up any of these third-party vendors and kind of, I guess, denied a developer key to them? The answer is yes, we have. It's way safer to say no than it is to say yes and for something to go wrong. You will be missing functionality if you say no. You will be missing a lot of sensitive data if you say yes and something goes wrong. Again, not vilifying all third-party vendors. It's just there's always a bad egg in every dozen.
Under what circumstances do you allow developer keys?
So under what circumstances have we allowed the use of developer keys? So we have our own security questionnaire, and basically the process I outlined in the presentation. I'm not part of the security office, so I don't review the questionnaires. I've sent them out to vendors before, but it's usually pretty common sense reasons. If they say that they're going to sell our data to some marketing company, of course we're going to say no to that, or we're going to change the conditions of our contract to say that they can't do that. So there is always a back and forth to this. It's not usually just a flat out no. That instance that I mentioned where we said no was after negotiating and not being able to come to an agreement.
But you also work on a contractual agreement to limit some of that.
Yes, and that's actually something I should have included in this too, yes, is that you should also, with any business dealing, not just developer keys, anything, you should always have some kind of contract in place, statement of work, some kind of thing that outlines exactly what that app is going to do and what it can't do, legally binding, all that, and I'm hashtag not a lawyer, so I can't really say much more than that, but I think I can take one more. You first.
My question is there any way to audit this? Because we can have all the contracts in the world, but I need a way to make sure on a regular basis that the data they say they're taking is the data.
Yeah, so is there any way to audit this? That would go back into the data, the Canvas data question from before. I'm not sure there really is a way. There is, the last time that dev key was used, that's really the data that you have. So, yes?
From yesterday's Instructure security session, one of the emails that they put out was security@instructure.com, so that's a perfect way to also audit, is start asking Instructure to provide a way to audit, to research for the scope of keys, start making our voices heard.
That's a very good point. Security@instructure.com. That is the email address for their security office. If you want to audit something, ask them. If you're concerned about and you want scoping, ask them. The more of us that ask them about that, the higher up the list they'll push it, I'm sure. So that's all the time we have for questions, but you feel free to come up. Thank you so much.